Well, I suppose I should explain how I came up with the title of this video, the moral ambiguity of social order, and just what it has to do with Sudhir Venkatesh's book, Gang Leader for a Day. Well, in the summer of 2019, a poet friend and I were conducting research on vigilante groups in the highlands of Guatemala. And well, we found ourselves in what you might call an interesting situation, both for its theoretical implications regarding organized crime in the state, but also for its ethical implications for doing the kind of deeply embedded ethnographic research that I personally love to do. Now, after about a week of interviews and meetings with the vigilantes at this or that secret location, the big boss man finally agreed to let us go on a night patrol with the whole group. This was important to me because up until that point, all I knew of what the vigilantes did came from what they themselves told me. And it's not that they lied outright or anything, but naturally, they portrayed themselves as a bunch of really stand-up guys, always fighting the good fight and keeping the nasty extortionist and drug gangs like the notorious MS-13 away from their town. And it was true, their town felt a lot safer than the next town over, which at the time was seeing over a dozen gang-related murders every single week. And this is a town about a third the size of Bellingham. But when it comes to people who wear masks and carry guns, you can't always take their word at face value, now can you? And so it was. I asked to go along on one of their patrols and they said, okay. And well, this is where things get a little bit bizarre. The story goes more or less like this. First, we have to meet them in a really dark field at midnight, a place where you can't see anything at all. But then somebody lights up a cigarette and suddenly you catch this split-second glimpse of like 50 armed men, all wearing ski masks and trench coats. Well, it's a bit spooky, I'm not going to lie. Spookier still when you notice that the vigilante leaders themselves, you can barely make out in the darkness, are drunk off their gourds. Now suddenly hands are all over you and you realize that you were being fitted like a mannequin with a trench coat and a mask, and they say, hey buddy, you gotta wear one of these too. And you're like, well, okay. But now you have the image in your head. My poet friend and I actually had to get dressed up like a bunch of goons in preparation to go wander the streets of Guatemala in search of bandits and gangsters and extortionists to go beat up. Perfectly normal, right? All good so far, I guess. But then the patrol starts, which is kind of a simple thing and kind of just strange. You got these 50 masked men, several of them very drunk, all of them armed with whips, clubs, pistols, or shotguns, and you're marching down this main street alongside of them in the middle of the night. You're stopping every car that drives by in order to interrogate them or really intimidate their drivers and search their vehicles, and in the process visibly terrifying these poor people. In the midst of all this, the highly inebriated gang boss or vigilante boss compels you, the researcher, to interview several of the drivers caught in the roadblock regarding their views about the good work the vigilantes are doing. Now recall, you're wearing a mask and a trench coat, and the car is surrounded by other people with masks, with shotguns and baseball bats. And so, as you can expect, these interview subjects all kind of said the same thing, which was something like, we love you, vigilantes. You're doing a wonderful job. Well, yeah, the point is, okay, there's 2 points that are relevant here to the gang leader for a day. The first is methodological. You see, certain areas of study, like vigilantism in Guatemala or crack gangs in Chicago, cannot easily or accurately be explored by using the kind of large-end quantitative research methods that are so often embraced in the social sciences for their supposed edge on objectivity and replicability. This is largely because vigilantes and crack gangs operating outside of the law generally don't share their data with government institutions. And what numerical data institutions like the police do provide about criminal groups is frequently biased, incomplete, or just plain wrong. And that's why some researchers, like me and like Sudhir Venkatesh, we opt for what we call ethnographic approaches, which basically just means that in a theoretically informed way, we try to live alongside the people and organizations that we study in the hope that by embedding ourselves, we can acquire a more complex and nuanced understanding of all the hows and whys of our subjects' behavior. And to be sure, for certain areas of study, this is a far, far more effective way of opening up that magical black box of causal mechanisms that social scientists are always so want to discover. However, as you probably have begun to imagine, ethnography has its problems too, and these problems are both ethical and empirical. Ethically, well, let me just put it this way. For me, it really felt awkward to put on a mask and terrify total strangers in a country that isn't even my own, just for the sake of scholarly research. And as for Sudhir Venkatesh, how do you think he felt when people started getting beat up or extorted because he unknowingly shared his research notes with one of his subjects? Or worse still, when he personally participated in the beating up of someone because, well, now his research subjects were expecting this of him. Now, empirically too, ethnography has some problems, most of which are related to how deeply the researcher sinks into one particular local environment. It's like the old heuristic. When you live in the woods, it often happens that you can't see the forest for the trees. Basically, the problem is that if you don't take a big step back to see the bigger picture from time to time, you as the ethnographer might easily start making big generalizing claims about the world that really don't make any sense at all outside that little microcosm that you've invested so much of your time and energy studying. For example, Sudhir Venkatesh spent about 5 years of his life hanging out with the likes of JT, Miss Bailey, and C-Note. And by doing so, he developed a remarkably clear picture of how life at the intersection of poverty, race, and drugs plays out. At the Robert Taylor Homes housing projects on the south side of Chicago in the early 1990s. Now, that's certainly not something quantitative research could uncover, but at the same time, Chicago is really kind of a special city, as Frederick Thrasher would surely have agreed. And there's reason to believe that things might not work the same everywhere else. Sudhir Venkatesh himself would agree too. His second book, Floating City, published in 2013, tells an entirely different story about how illicit markets and criminal networks function in New York City nearly 2 decades later. But let's get back to the title of this video. What's up with the moral ambiguity of social order? Well, for much of the 20th century, social scientists depicted high crime neighborhoods as areas that were essentially lacking any kind of stable social order. There were places where, as you might recall from Thrasher, traditional social institutions were failing or they were non-existent, where chaos reigned. And it was for this lack of order and structure that young kids so often got off the track and they found themselves committed to a life of crime. But ethnographies like that of Gang Leader for a Day reveal that this isn't quite the case. In Robert Taylor Homes, for example, Sudhir discovers that there is, in fact, a clear, if complex, social order that is maintained by an elaborate, informal network of local power brokers. Somewhere at the top there's JT, the local leader of the Black Kings gang, but his control over the tenants at the projects is highly dependent on constantly negotiated and renegotiated dealings with other powerful figures. Figures like Miss Bailey, C-Note, and even the police. Or maybe especially even the police. Now, in this context, these informal networks of power and control, these informal structures of authority and order, well, in the absence of effective state institutions and more conventional mechanisms of social order and welfare, like say churches and schools and such, well, these informal networks and structures are precisely what guarantee the most basic functioning and survival of the community. They provide food for the children who are all but abandoned by their parents. They provide safe places for drug addicts, well, for the down and outs, and for those who must prostitute themselves in order to put food on the table for their children. They protect those who are getting robbed or beaten by some or another ill infiltrator of the community. They make and they enforce a local law, brutish but effective, that provides predictability of process and outcome for the conflict-ridden day-to-day life in the projects. In many ways, the architects of this informal social order, people like JT, well, they should be praised. We kind of want to praise them at least, for in their own way, they are all just victims of an unjust and unequal social system that left whole sectors of the population reeling in poverty and destitution. They are victims who have taken upon themselves, with precious little help from the government, or no help at all, to provide some sort of safety net for the most vulnerable members of their community. But it is here where the moral quality of this social order becomes ambiguous. No one among this informal network of power brokers is really an angel. In fact, by the standards of what I call our middle-class moral sensibilities, most everyone is kind of disreputable. I mean, JT he's selling crack to kids, encouraging prostitution, and engaging in acts of great physical violence. Miss Bailey looks sweet and kind on the surface, but she's using her contacts in the Chicago Housing Authority to extort and control her neighbors. Clarice, meanwhile, says she's prostituting her body to help feed her kids, but frequently enough, she smokes away everything she earns, letting her kids go hungry while she's hitting up the crack pipe. And then there's C-Note. Well, maybe there's nothing at all wrong with C-Note. He's pretty lovable, I guess. The point is, whatever the source of social order in any community, be it formal or informal, the sources and mechanisms of this social order are often not morally clear. That is, while we sometimes imagine that the people and the institutions that guarantee our survival and our peaceful coexistence, we imagine them to be morally good, and we have an idea of who the bad people are, those who are threatening our social harmony, in actual point of fact, that notion is really all just fantasy. Actual social order is messy. It's morally ambiguous, almost always. Which brings me back to Guatemala. Before I left the country in 2019, several of the vigilantes I met proudly showed me cell phone videos of some of their town cleanup work, referring to the ridding of criminal elements. I wanted to see these videos because, wow, their town really did feel so much safer than other towns I had traveled to. And that was a nice feeling, indeed. And so, I wanted to see how they achieved this, and I wanted to congratulate them on the good job. But then the videos, there were videos of the men themselves lynching people who had been accused of this or that, videos in which they beat and whipped their victims for hours. They dragged them through the streets until they slipped in and out of consciousness. And finally, they doused their naked, bloodied bodies with gasoline, and they lit them on fire. Yeah, the moral ambiguity of social order. But what do you think? I'm Professor Michael Wolff, and this is Gangs, Organized Crime, and the State in the Americas Online.
Soy el fuego que arde tu piel, soy el agua que mata tu sed, el castillo, la torre yo soy, la espada que guarda el caudal, tú el aire que respiro yo, y la luz de la luna en el mar, la garganta que